Hey, I'm Mark. Let's go, let's go. Got a lot to discuss this period. Lockdown's done, but no one's at school. So I'm back here behind the card table, behind the tablecloth. Nobody knows what I got from the waist down. Trying to look as professional as possible. Today, I'm going to try to put some history behind the current situation with China and the coronavirus. Why? Because I'm a history teacher and I'm going rogue. Coronavirus. Wow, man. Made a mess of the American economy. It's got us yelling and screaming at each other. You would think there was something purposefully unleashed on the world. I'm not going to go all red state, blue state on you. We should open up the economy. No, we should stay locked down until the virus is gotten rid of. You can watch Fox or CNN for that analysis. Me? I'm just a lonely history teacher trying to make his way through life. I do have a master's degree in history, and I've taught AP history courses in high school, and I've taught a couple of classes at the college level. In terms of history, I would say that I know more than most, but not quite as much as some. So this coronavirus originated in Wuhan, China. Originally, it was reported that it was transmitted from a bat that was bought in a wet market to be consumed later on at a later date. Then there was evidence that the virus escaped from a laboratory in Wuhan. Well, what might be going on here? I mean, the Chinese aren't saying, and they're not letting anybody in to investigate and find the truth. History, man. What was China, and how does its past impact what it is today? Historically, the Chinese refer to their country as Zhong, or the Middle Kingdom. Look at it in two dimensions. You've got all the nations of the earth and China in the center, and everything revolves around China. Those nations nearest to China had to pay tribute to their overlords or be overrun by them at some later date. Then in a third dimension, here is heaven, here is earth, and China is somewhere in between heaven and earth, blessed by heaven above all other nations. Flash forward to the 1830s and 1840s. British traders were making millions of dollars, pounds actually, selling opium to willing consumers in China. Watching the destruction of their country at the hands of the British made the Chinese emperors demand that the British stop imports of opium that was poisoning their country. When the British refused, war broke out, and the Chinese were quickly defeated by the British. Under the terms of the treaty that followed, the British were allowed unrestricted imports of opium. China entered into what they call the Century of Humiliation. The Chinese didn't win a war for the next 100 years, and they were dominated by the Europeans and the Japanese, and they had hundreds of millions killed in the continual violence of rebellions, wars, and slaughter from enemies foreign and domestic. The Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong took control of the government in 1949 after driving the nationalist party of Chiang Kai-shek off of the mainland. The United States didn't recognize the Chi-Coms as the legitimate government of China, continuing to recognize the nationalists now on the island of Taiwan. That changed in the early 1970s when Richard Nixon went to China and recognized the Communist Chinese. We still didn't engage the Chinese in trade and block the reference of joining the global economy until Bill Clinton normalized relations with China in the 1990s. The impoverished of China became a source of cheap labor, and soon the country was the manufacturing center of the world. If you wanted something built cheap, send it to China. And every producer wants goods built cheap. Americans and other nations' intellectual property was ended up in the hands of the Chinese, though, through its trade practices and by straight-up theft. And by the mid-2010s, manufacturing drove a Chinese economy that was almost matching the size of the United States. Financed by the phenomenal growth of its economy, China went back to being Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, around which all other societies revolve. It quietly started building artificial islands extending out into the South China Sea and created a strong naval presence there to harass and threaten the shipping of others. it quietly extended itself into Africa, helping itself to the resources of its new satellite states on the continent. The Belt and Road Initiative is a Chinese-led infrastructure program that seeks to improve facilities to better connect Africa and Europe to Asia. Italy was one of the first European countries to sign on to this program. When Donald Trump became president in 2017, he wanted to reverse the momentum that China had in moving towards dominating the global economy. The ensuing trade war created an economic downturn in the Chinese economy for which they were not prepared. So, pull the pandemic card. If we begin to connect the dots, you might see a concerted effort by the Chicoms to engage the world in some form of global biological warfare, to weaken its enemies and to take advantage of the chaos. A lesson learned from the Opium Wars of the 1800s. If the West is willing to defeat China, poison them with opium, then turnabout is fair play. When the outbreak occurred, the Chicoms didn't tell the rest of the world. Victims in Wuhan were locked inside their homes. Whistleblowers and doctors just disappeared, and news from the city was censored. The Chinese didn't allow anyone into Wuhan, but allowed people to leave the city, infected with the virus, to go see the rest of the world. The two countries most immediately impacted by the virus? Iran and Italy. Two countries with the deepest ties to China. By proximity, South Korea was hit hard as well. They got over it pretty quickly now. And ESPN is now featuring the only real sports available worldwide. Korean professional baseball. 5 o'clock every morning. Back to the run-up of World War II. Adolf Hitler could make his territorial gains, the Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, because the rest of the world was simply trying to make it through the Great Depression. The Japanese militarists did the same thing. They were particularly brutal to China. Unlike the Nazis or the Japanese in the 1930s, the Chicoms are using a knife of sugar. In an effort to ingratiate themselves to the world, the Chicoms use their influence in the World Health Organization to get high marks. After hoarding masks and ventilators and antibiotics needed to help fight the virus, they offered to help countries by shipping those needed things to those countries in need. Sort of like pulling your butt from shark-infested waters after throwing you overboard. Thanks. China's pushed back vociferously against countries that have publicly stated that Wuhan was the source of the virus. When many European countries demanded answers, the Chinese said that they were simply being puppets of the United States. When Australia asked for an investigation of the source of the virus, China slapped them with tariffs. By the way, it's not uncommon to see totalitarian governments sacrifice a few of their own for the betterment of the state. Coronavirus makes younger people sick with flu-like symptoms that they easily get over. But it's fatal to the elderly. Over the 40-year history of China's one-child policy, its demographics have changed significantly, with a very large elderly population above a smaller working population that must support them. For the Chinese, the deaths of 100 million elderly people sucking off of the system, although certainly not intended, it's an economically beneficial byproduct of the outbreak. With the coronavirus and the quarantines that followed, the American economy now has 40 million unemployed. And while the United States focuses on problems at home, the Chinese are making strategic moves that it couldn't make earlier with the United States standing over the top of them. Think about this. As stock prices have tumbled around the world, who do you suppose has the money to buy up all these stocks at now bargain basement prices? So where have the Chinese been active over the last 3 months? The first place China's been active has been in the Himalayas. A few weeks ago, the Chinese made a public statement stating that Mount Everest, the world's tallest mountain, is in China. It's in Nepal. Chinese troops have been active near the border of the Indian region of Sikkim, leading to a round of skirmishes with Indian troops in recent weeks. The Chinese have also pressed the Kingdom of Bhutan concerning their region of Doklam. In its west, the Chinese have placed upwards of 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in detention camps. In the last couple of weeks, 2 state-run internet services in Beijing have run articles stating that Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are part of what is historically Chinese territory. The story went on to say that the Kazakhs do not have too many complaints about being repeatedly invaded by China. Does this indicate a Chinese move deeper into Central Asia? The most egregious actions being taken by the Chinese are in the South China Sea. This is one of, if not the most important waterways in the world, connecting the Far East with the Middle East and Europe. By dominating the South China Sea, China can make shipping difficult or impossible for any of its competitors, like the United States. Also last month, while its neighbors were dealing with COVID-19, China renamed scores of islands in the South China Sea that don't belong to them with Chinese names to reaffirm its sovereignty over the region. It has also created a new administrative system for the Paracel and the Spratly Islands, which are located between the Philippines and Vietnam. Both countries claim the islands. The Chinese, much further away, also claim them. China has announced that the Paracel Islands will now be governed from the Hainan province and that the Spratly Islands will be administered from Fiery Cross Reef, a series of artificial islands built by the Chinese military in the middle of the South China Sea. To back up their claim, the Chinese have pointed guns at Filipino fishing vessels near one of the Chinese claimed islands within the 200-mile exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, inside what international law would consider to be Philippine territory. They also forced the evacuation of a Vietnamese oil rig off the coast of Vietnam. China, man. Have they gotten the upper hand in World War III without even firing a shot? Is our great democracy at risk because while we sit and snipe from the right and the left, the Chinese maneuver its way towards global domination? Wake up, America. We had to play from behind in 2 different world wars. Will we have what it takes to play from behind again in a third? Or maybe I'm just reading too much into world events. I hope I am. But if I'm not, I hope my country, still the most powerful in the world, will take the right measures to counter these actions by the Chinese before it's too late. Hey, thanks for coming by. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something. If I did it right, you did both. So what do you think? Leave a note in the comments. Did I connect the dots, or am I just crying wolf? It's a little different from what I usually do, but it was on my mind. You know what I like to do. History through TV, through movies, through sports. I like Chinese food, but once in a while, what I really like are hamburgers and hot dogs. Western bacon cheeseburger. I had fun, don't quit my day job, and remember me the next time you hear about the Chinese threatening some other small little country someplace. I'm Mark Haggard. I'm a history teacher, and I've got to run.